and universal group membership caching. In this nugget, we're taking a look at the issue of what a global catalog is and how to configure it. First thing we'll look at is the purpose of a global catalog, and just in brief, its purpose is so that we can identify and locate any object throughout the entire forest. And there are certain searchable attributes within the global catalog that your objects will have enabled. So it's pretty much so you can find stuff. Also, we have a configuration issue. The configuration of the global catalog is really very simple. It's a simple little checkbox that I'll show you how to select. And then there's another issue as well that relates to what kind of traffic you have for your network and whether or not you need a global catalog. Because in certain locations where you have slow or unreliable WAN links, that are small sites, you might need to enable universal group membership caching. And that would prevent you from having to install a global catalog and to have a lot of replication traffic down to that domain controller. On the other hand, it still allows your users to log on if that link goes down and a global catalog server is unavailable. One thing I'll always remember about my dad was that he always knew just a little about everything. I mean, he would know the names of past presidents. He would know things about science, what the names of certain flowers were, and flora and fauna. And he'd know about different vocabulary words that had more syllables than I know how to count. So he kind of knew just a little bit about everything. And in Active Directory, we have something a lot like that as well, and it's called the Global Catalog. You see, the Global Catalog knows about every single object in an entire forest. Now, that's not going to be too comprehensive if you have a small domain and it's only a single domain. But you may also have other situations, maybe something like this, where you've got a bunch of different parent-child domains here. You got two different trees in this same forest that we've got. We've got universal groups here. We've got a single user account here that we're working with. So we may have all different kinds of things that you need to work with. Now, this really comes into play when it comes to the global catalog, because we need to make sure that we carefully control access throughout the entire forest, because remember from our last nugget, that even though you have trust relationships between your domains, that does not necessarily mean that a domain admin or a user over in this domain has control over anything in this domain, at least until we grant them access. And by the way, there is an exception to that. Let me point that out, just as a quick tangent here. This is the first domain that was created in this forest, and as such, the local members of the administrators group in this domain do have the ability to add membership to domain admins groups throughout the rest of the forest, and enterprise admins likewise have those and similar privileges. So memberships of those two groups do have more privilege than domain admins or other kinds of administrators throughout the rest of these domains. But in any case, the global catalog, as I mentioned earlier, knows a little bit about everything in this entire universe of this forest. So here I might have my global catalog, and by default, the first domain controller that you install in the entire forest is your only global catalog. And if you just happen to overlook it and you never think about installing any others, then you have a single point of failure here in what looks like a pretty large enterprise that probably has, could be tens of thousands of users. And if this one global catalog server, which is always going to be a domain controller, it can't be a member server, an XP machine, anything like that. If this one global catalog domain controller fails, then you'll have people throughout your entire organization that cannot log on. And in that case, you'll be probably writing a new resume. Now, I'll show you how to make other domain controllers global catalog servers a little bit later on. It's really easy to do, and it's not something that should be overlooked. In any case, this global catalog server has a real critical purpose, a critical responsibility. That is really three of them. The first one is user principal name. So if down here in New York, I've got a user named Hal, and Hal doesn't like to log on to Hal at newyork.nuggetlab.com like we talked about in our last nugget where people don't like to log on with all those letters. Well, we gave him a user principal name, and now he can just log on with Hal at ops.com because he works in our operations department. Now, what we have with that then is that when he logs on, the system has to look at a way of breaking down the constituent parts of this user principal name. How does it do that? Well, it looks to the global catalog. It says, hey, global catalog, I don't know how to break this up on my own because we don't have an ops.com. So it'll query against the global catalog, and any queries against the global catalog happen over a specific port, which is 3268, just FYI. So make sure that if you have a firewall here, and these are actually also sites that separate these two domains, make sure that your firewall will allow that port to go through. So again, the global catalog will crack apart the constituent parts of the user principal name. Now, if Hal is logging on to, just FYI here, if he's logging onto a Windows 2000 box, then the 2000 box will always go to a global catalog server to crack apart the constituent parts. On the other hand, if he's logging on with a Windows XP or later computer, then it's going to catch the cracked name after the user logs on that first time. Now let's take a look at something else that happens when a user logs on, though, and that's really also relative to the global catalog. You see, when this user logs on, even though he's got this user principal name, if his account's in this domain, it's really going to be this domain controller here that authenticates this user. Now, there's a Kerberos transaction that takes place in that, but in one of the tickets that's sent back to the user side of things when they're on their computer down here, in that ticket is going to be a privilege access certificate. That's going to include the group memberships to which this user account belongs. And then later on, that's going to be placed inside of a token, which is a memory resident token that the user kind of carries with them anytime they try to touch another server like this server over here. And then when they present that token, which contains then that SID for that group membership that they're a member of, then they will be either granted or denied access based upon the access control list on the share or the print or whatever other resource it is that's on this server over here. Now, this user account is a member of this Universal Ops security group. And as a result of that fact, they should be able to gain access to this file share down here for which they have permission in the ACL. Problem is, how does this domain controller know how to build the pack that says that they have this group membership over here? Well, you guessed it. It's because of the global catalog it's able to do that. You see, the groups are all in the domain naming context. This domain controller here has a domain naming context for its own domain local and global groups, and so do all the other domain controllers throughout my entire forest. It may also have some universal security groups here as well, but it only knows about its own universal security groups. Over here, I've got another domain controller in la.cbtnuggets.com that has this Universal Ops universal security group. And that is stored in this domain controller's domain naming context. Therefore, this domain controller has no way of knowing by itself that this user is a member of this security group. That's where the global catalog comes in. You see, again, just like my dad, the global catalog knows a little bit about everything. The global catalog knows about all of the objects and all of the attributes within its own domain. And it knows about partial attributes, in other words, what we call a partial attribute set for all the other objects in all of the other domains. So therefore, one of the things that it's going to know about is it's going to know about this universal security group down here. And in addition, it knows the exact membership of this universal security group. So it knows that hal@ops.com, that user account is a member of this security group. Now, the global catalog also knows about all of the domain local and all the global groups throughout every domain throughout this enterprise. However, it only knows the names of those objects. It doesn't have the exact membership of all of those objects. Again, we depend upon individual domain controllers in each domain to provide that information. Now, another good reason for having a global catalog is for various kinds of applications. For example, Exchange 2000 will use Active Directory as its directory service, and all mailbox names are going to be resolved by queries through Active Directory to the global catalog server. So if I've got an Exchange server down here, it needs that global catalog server. Now, this brings up another issue, and we'll cover this more when we get to things like sites later on. But first of all, these two domains could be in the same physical location, and they could be in the same server closet. They could be in the same rack of computers, in fact. However, likewise, they could also be thousands of miles apart. And if they are, and they're separated by a slow WAN link, then I might have, a 56K WAN link here that separates these two domains because they're also in different physical cities. Now, if that's the case, this Exchange server is going to be pumping a lot of queries back and forth to this global catalog server over a 56K WAN link. That's going to significantly slow down this WAN link and use a lot of network bandwidth. And it's also going to slow down the response time for this Exchange server to probably an unacceptable level. So that's when it would probably be a good idea to add another global catalog server in down here on this domain controller. Just make this another global catalog server. I'll show you how to do that shortly here. But we'll make this a global catalog server as well. That way my Exchange server is immediately making queries against this domain controller and getting answers back on the same high-speed LAN instead of having to go across this slow WAN link. Now, of course, that would also present another problem that you can probably see right here as well. You're saying, okay, we've got a 56K link here still, but we got global catalog data here, global catalog data here, which again is a collection of all of the objects through all of the domains throughout my entire forest. That means that if there's some big changes, then I've got to pump a lot of global catalog replication traffic across this slow WAN link. Now I'm back in the same spot I was before. I'm still using a lot of traffic across this WAN link. That slow WAN link is going to look like the snake that swallowed the elephant. It's got so much traffic going through there. And that's where we can move into other things that we'll discuss in a later nugget, such as your site topology. Maybe this is a 56K WAN link, but this is a T1 link here over at 1.544 megabits per second, and maybe we got a T1 link between these two sites as well. Well, in that case, we could replicate from up here to down here to down here, and we could get pretty good traffic going through this direction. And in that case, this would probably just be some kind of a DSL line or a dial-up modem connection just for emergencies that only goes hot if this connection here fails, for example. Okay, so let's take a look at how we actually make a domain controller a global catalog server. And in order to do that, you'll go to Active Directory Sites and Services from the Administrative Tools Start menu. Once you're into that, you simply browse down to the computer object that you want. And in this case, DC Nugget 1 was the first domain controller in the entire forest, so it's already going to be a global catalog server. But you can confirm that by right-clicking on NTDS Settings, which is NT Directory Services Settings, and then going to Properties, and you see that there's already a checkbox there for the global catalog. So what I want to do here is to give myself some redundancy, because I've only got one global catalog right now. And if people can't find, or if the logon process cannot find a global catalog server during the logons, then it will not allow users to log on. And so that could be catastrophic to my organization. By the way, the only accounts that can log on are administrator accounts, like my domain admins. They can still log on even without a global catalog. And of course that makes sense, because somebody will probably have to log on to a domain controller somewhere and fix the mess. So that's why it still allows that loophole for logging on. Now I'll go to DC Nugget 2 here, go to its properties, and we see that it is not a global catalog. No other domain controller will be made a global catalog automatically apart from that first domain controller in the forest. So in my case, I'm going to select that checkbox and click OK. And now, through normal Active Directory replication, and DC Nugget 2 is going to get all the global catalog data that it needs. And by the way, the global catalog data is not a separate data entity apart from your normal ntds.dit file. Global catalog data is also stored in the ntds.dit. The only difference is whether or not a domain controller has a flag that marks it as a global catalog server. For that, let me just go to a utility called LDP, and I'll just demonstrate that to you briefly. Now this utility, if you're going to really be deep in Active Directory, it really helps to be able to know something about this tool. Although there's quite a lot of depth into it, well, for our purposes, we're just going to click on Connection and click on Connect. And I'm going to connect to the local server, so I can just click OK. The other thing I could do here, by the way, is since I'm looking only for global catalog information, is I could query for port 3268, and that's the only port that this tool will work with then. And then, as soon as I click OK here, we see that we get some attribute data about this particular domain controller. And what we're interested in right now is down here at the bottom. It says, is global catalog ready? Equals true. So it is a global catalog server. That's one way, apart from looking at Active Directory sites and services, that you could confirm your global catalog. And I can use this tool remotely across the network and connect to other domain controllers to find that out as well. Now another tool that I could use is RepleMon, and this tool will allow you to also check for global catalog servers. I'll just add the local server for the time being, and you'll see where I'm going with this. I'll just enter in DC Nugget 1, if I can type here. And then once I've gotten to that, what I want to do is to locate the global catalog servers. So I'll right-click on DC Nugget 1 and choose Show Global Catalog Servers in Enterprise. It couldn't be any easier than that. Click on that, and it shows me I've got 2 global catalog servers. That's pretty much it. Now again, just so that we can avoid any confusion here, these two global catalog servers do not even need to be in the same domain, and in fact, DC Nugget 2 is in a different domain in the same forest. DC Nugget 2 is the domain controller for cbtnuggets.com. DC Nugget 1 is the domain controller for nuggetlab.com. Because they're global catalog servers, they will have all of the objects and all of the attributes for their own domains, and they will have a partial attribute set for all the objects in the other domain. And again, the fact that it has only a partial set of attributes for that other domain is what we call the partial attribute set. It contains only about 200 of the 1,700 attributes that are in the schema. And then quickly let me point out a couple of other things with global catalogs and their placement here as well. If I have another domain controller that I promoted in this domain, and then this original domain controller, which is also my global catalog in this forest, I bring it down, and if you bring it down gracefully using DC promo, then it'll prompt you and say, hey, this is a global catalog server. Make sure you have another one before you bring this one down. Of course, the purpose for that being that we would otherwise be left without a global catalog server, no way to check universal group memberships and the like, and then we wouldn't have the ability to log on in the domain. So be aware of that issue. Another issue to be aware of is, what if you have only one domain? Let's forget all the rest of this. Let's just say that cbtnuggets.com is my only domain here. I've got a couple of domain controllers in this domain. Now, of course, your first one, if this is how you're promoting this, is going to be a global catalog server, because always the first domain controller in the forest is the global catalog server. But what about this other one that's not a global catalog server? Should I make it a global catalog server if I only have one domain? Because I don't have this issue of cross-domain universal group issues. Well, sure, you should still do that. Why? Because it gives you good redundancy, and it does not give you any penalty in terms of hardware utilization or in terms of performance. Because remember, the global catalog really is still part of ntds.dip. It's really just a matter of whether or not the global catalog flag is set to true or false. And if you've only got one domain, then you don't have the issue of piling on additional domain naming context from a whole bunch of other domains and piling that into the global catalog server and increasing its network bandwidth and all that kind of stuff. So again, single domain, you might just as well make all of your domain controllers global catalogs. Well, let's address again the issue of a slow WAN link here and how that affects your global catalogs. Here I've got my Phoenix headquarters site, and I've got the root of the forest at nuggetlab.com in this site. Then I have a child domain, mines.nuggetlab.com, in another site called Goldfield. Well, what in the world is Goldfield about? Actually, it is a location, and you'll see in the Phoenix metropolitan area here, we're down in the way far southeast part of the Phoenix metropolitan area, down here where Apache Junction is and all of that. And the Goldfield area is pretty much in this whole area right through here. Here's the Goldfield Mountains, in fact, right there. In any case, this is rich in the history of Arizona, because there was quite a lot of gold mining that went on in there in the 1800s, and in fact there's still active gold mining operations going on there today. The problem is, I think at one point in the 1800s, they were mining down there, and somebody broke through a wall that separated an aquifer, an underground aquifer, from the mines, and it flooded the entire mine. And nobody's ever been able to figure out since then how to get to that gold, which apparently is at the richest portion of this whole mining area. Nobody can get to that gold now, so it's just there. Maybe if you're a good swimmer or a scuba diver, you might want to give it a try or something. Also, at the southeastern portion of this whole Goldfield area is the Superstition Mountains, which are some of the most beautiful mountains in all of Arizona. And here's a picture of some of them right here. This is where Cochise and the Apache Indians used to hang out, apparently out in this area. And medicine men were the only ones that were allowed to go up into these mountains. And in fact, if anybody else went up there, even another Indian, they would kill them on sight. And apparently that's because they trusted a lot of magic going on in these mountains or something like that. So anyway, that whole Goldfield area is very rich in the history of America and of Arizona. And what we want to do is to establish a mining operation. Maybe we figured out how to mine underwater or something. Well, here we have an issue where we've got a global catalog up here at the root of our forest, so that's to be expected. But the issue here is, do we put another global catalog down here in the mines.nuggetlab.com domain? You see, I'm separated by a 56K WAN link, and I've only got, let's say, 12 users down here. So is it really worth it to install another domain controller, or rather to make this domain controller, the existing one, an additional global catalog, and have replication traffic of global catalog traffic back and forth across this WAN link? Well, in this case, it probably wouldn't be too big of a hassle. Just go ahead and leave one global catalog up here, or even have multiple global catalogs up here for redundancy, and not to install a global catalog server down here if we don't want to replicate that global catalog replication traffic across this slow link. Because when a user logs on, all they're going to do is blip across this 56K link to check against the global catalog, and then to get the universal group membership and things like that. Resolve user principal names, things of this nature. And that is not probably going to choke out your 56K WAN link here. However, you're more likely to install a global catalog down here, GC, if this 56K WAN link is unreliable. So if it goes down, once or twice a month, or, enough so that everybody's frustrated down here in mines.nuggetlab.com, then we would probably do this instead. Either install our own global catalog server down here, Or alternatively, we could do something else called setting up universal group membership caching. And what universal group membership caching does is this. It does not install a global catalog server down here. Instead, what we'll do is go to Active Directory sites and services, and through a certain property checkbox, we will enable universal group membership caching here. Then when we have a user account log on, and when that user account log on takes a look up through this WAN link and checks the global catalog for things like its universal group membership, then it will cache that on one of my domain controllers down here. So it's not an actual global catalog server, but it does cache that universal group information. That way, if this WAN link does go down, then this user can still log on because this cached information will be used to identify that user's universal group membership. And in Windows 2000, I would be prevented from logging on here because there would be no way to connect to the global catalog server to check my universal group membership, but now I can. And now, even when we restore this 56K WAN link and it's available again, when the logon from this user takes place again next time, it's not going to go across the WAN link to check with the global catalog servers because it knows that it already has this information locally cached on this domain controller, so we'll also conserve our network bandwidth across this WAN link. Now, this universal group membership cache will stay current because every 8 hours it will refresh itself by sending out a message to an available global catalog. That message is a universal group membership confirmation request. The universal group membership can cache up to 500 universal group memberships at one time. And as a result of that, we're also going to get faster logons here because we're not going across this WAN link. Also, if you have a large global catalog, now there's not going to be a need to upgrade the hardware of this domain controller to handle that larger global catalog size or traffic. Now also keep in mind that because of the fact that Windows 2000 does not understand this universal group membership caching idea, if you're running in native mode, you can't use this. And if you have Windows 2000 domain controllers, you can't use the universal group membership caching. The other thing to understand is that universal group membership caching is not a complete substitute for the global catalog. Because again, down here, if I've got an Exchange server right there, then we're still going to have to use the actual global catalog to resolve the queries because this Exchange server is going to use port 3268, whereas a universal group membership caching server does not listen on that port, so it would not be able to serve that Exchange server. Now, once you decide that you need to enable universal group membership caching, how are you going to do that? Well, here I've just opened Active Directory Sites and Services, which, as I'm sure you know, is on the Administrative Tools Start menu. And what you do is you do this on a site basis. Now, in Goldfield, I just have that one little domain controller right here, DC Nugget 3. And what I'll do then is to right-click on, when I select Goldfield here, this particular site, I'll go to NTDS Site Settings, which you see right here. Now, we'll talk more about how to create sites and how to work with all of this in a future nugget. But for the time being, just to enable Universal Group Membership Caching, you simply right-click on NTDS Site Settings and choose Properties. Now, let me point something out here before I click that. Don't confuse this right here, because the icon is the same and the names are very similar, with this item right here. If you right-click here, you're not going to get what you want. What you want to do is, again, is go to the site, right-click, choose Properties, and then once you get here, it's very simple. You just click the box. Then the other thing you can do here, then, is to specify from which location you want to refresh the cache. You can refresh the cache from the Phoenix site or from the Goldfield site. Now, there's nothing to refresh from in Goldfield because I don't have any global catalog servers there. So what I can do instead is to go to the Phoenix site here. Now, what you could also do is just leave it at the default setting here. And we see that setting here in the little bracket thing is default, and that will just calculate the most efficient route to another site that does have a global catalog server. So it's a little bit blind. We're not really sure which one it would go to if we had multiple sites. In our case, it has to go to Phoenix, so we know that when we select default, it will go to Phoenix, or we could just manually choose Phoenix. Either one would work just fine, because they're really going to the same place. And then you just OK that, and that's pretty much it. Now, any domain controllers that are in the Goldfield site, if I added another one there, it would also cache Universal Group memberships. Now, you may also be wondering, well, sometimes it sounds like I should install a global catalog, but other times it kind of sounds like I should install a Universal Group Membership Caching or enable that feature. Which one am I supposed to do? Well, with the global catalog, you're going to install that if you have an application that needs a global catalog. In other words, if you have applications that perform queries over port 3268. Because remember, universal group membership caching does not respond to that port. So if that's the case, then I'm going to have to install a global catalog, and if it's got a lot of network bandwidth that is required for the replication, I'm just going to have to suck it up. I'm just going to have to deal with it. Also, what if I have a large number of users? If I have greater than 100 users here, again, that's probably a pretty good candidate for installing a global catalog, simply because I can warrant the presence of a global catalog because I have a heavier dependence upon it there. Also, do I have roaming users? Because remember, a universal group membership caching is only useful for people that have already logged on to a domain controller in that site. Now, if I have a user that's roaming and they're coming into my site today and they're logging on for the first time because they're from another office, and if I get that pretty frequently, then I'm going to need to have a global catalog there instead of universal group membership caching, especially if my WAN link is unavailable. Now, conversely, I can look at installing or enabling universal group membership caching if I don't have any applications that require queries over port 3268, such as Exchange, which needs it for the mailbox lookups. Also, if I have less dependency on a global catalog, as in the case where I've got less than 100 users. By the way, that's not a hard and fast number. That's just a starting point to think about. With less than 100 users, I might not need a global catalog, don't have as heavy a dependence upon it. Also, do I have users that roam from one office to the next? If I have users that are visiting my little branch office from another location, I might not want to use universal group membership caching because they might log on for the first time and they won't have any group memberships cached there. On the other hand, if I just log on the same users day in and day out, don't have any roaming, might be a good candidate for universal group membership caching in the event that my WAN link here becomes unavailable or it's oversubscribed. It might be unavailable if somebody cuts a backhoe through it, or if weather conditions cause my lines to go down frequently, something like that. Or it could also be unavailable, quote unquote, if it's just an oversubscribed line and I'm really having trouble pumping megabytes of global catalog data through that line on a frequent basis. And if I want to conserve my bandwidth, then another candidate would be here for the universal group membership caching. In this nugget, we addressed the global catalog, which, kind of like my dad, knows just a little bit about everything. I mean, if there's an object in Active Directory, the global catalog knows about it. Might not know everything about it, because it doesn't have all the attributes, but at least it knows something about it, and that's the purpose of the global catalog, is so that it can find those objects, and also so that it can do things such as to parse UPN names and break apart the constituent parts of a UPN name when someone tries to log on, and check the universal group memberships of your users. Also, I told you how to configure the global catalog, and it's a very simple checkbox that you select. In many smaller environments with not too many domains or not too many objects in the domain, that's a pretty simple thing to do, and you don't really have to worry about replication traffic too much. In larger organizations, in large forests with many, many domains, you might have to have more of a consideration for that. And sometimes that replication traffic becomes a big issue, and that's why you might need universal group membership caching. So if you've got a small office, for example, that's got a slow or unreliable WAN link, then you might want to enable universal group membership caching so that you don't have to put a global catalog dedicated down in that small site so that it can cut down on replication traffic. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.